book. And if we're all ready, I'd like to turn to Nick, who will talk about his recently published book.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francois. Thanks to everyone for being here. And let's take a moment the day after Indigenous Peoples Day to recognize the Tutelumanakan people, the original stewards of this land, who have been violently dispossessed. And my book is about the continuation, of course, of the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, but now through democracy and development. So I will point out also, before I begin the talk, that this book is free. The ebook is free thanks to a grant from the Virginia Tech Library System, so you can download it from the Cornell University Press website. They have an open access page. The title of the book is The Democracy Development Machine, Neoliberalism, Radical Pessimism, and Authoritarian Populism in Mayan Guatemala. And as many of you may know, Guatemala is a neo-colonial apartheid state with a large indigenous underclass and with one of the most unequal distributions of land in the world, and also one of the highest rates of infant malnutrition. In 1954, as many of you also know, a US-sponsored coup took down a democratically elected president, reversing his signature policy of land reform, shutting down the country's short experiment with democracy, and they instituted then a military dictatorship that set the stage for decades of armed conflict with Marxist revolutionary movements. After several years of organizing in the rural highlands in the 1970s, a ruthless scorched earth campaign in 1981 and 1983, between those years, killed tens of thousands to uproot a Marxist revolutionary movement that was growing, including the elimination of 400 entire villages. This was in a form of intense cruelty on a mass scale, and it was followed by one of the most intensive counterinsurgency campaigns in the hemisphere. This was, of course, the handiwork of General Rios Montt, a good friend of Ronald Reagan's in the 1980s, for those of you who are interested in this history. During 15 years of military occupation, the army led a transition to democracy in these communities as part of and as an extension of a counterinsurgency. About 10 years later, propelled by an alliance of indigenous and popular movements, peace accords finally ended the war in 1996, calling for historic reforms, establishing truth commissions, and generating a lot of excitement for meaningful, far-reaching change. Alongside the peace processes, indigenous political organizations at the grassroots level had taken over municipal governments throughout the highlands, displacing mestizo minorities in what were really hard-won political victories. But there was much cause for concern. The peace accords declared Guatemala a multicultural democracy, but they also paved the way for a transition to neoliberalism, or free markets. This was not the same vision of social democracy that revolutionaries had died for. It was in fact designed by the military as a means of consolidating their political victory. And indeed, the post-accords era has witnessed the fragmentation of the left and the rise of the far right, including the party led by Rios Montt himself, whose political discourse blended evangelical moralizing, populism, and pro-military themes from the armed conflict. To the surprise and consternation of many, his party's main base of political support were the very indigenous Mayan communities where he had been the primary intellectual author of genocide. This, of course, raises many questions. What was the relationship between indigenous people, Mayans, as they're now understood and identified, and the revolutionary movement? How had their thinking changed through the counterinsurgency and the transition to democracy? How specifically was democracy constructed in rural villages? And what were its effect on political imaginaries, affects, political practices, and capacities for collective action? My book explores these questions ethnographically in the rural Mayan town of San Pedro Necta in rural Huehuetenango, which was the site of FRG victory in 2003, which was the year that Rios Montt ran for president, where I conducted over 17 months of field work between 2003 and 2014. The Democracy Development Machine describes how democracy was not a universal form, but was in fact composed of various kinds of development: memory-focused development, market-oriented individual capacity development, infrastructure projects, and other kinds of personal projects. They were implemented alongside state multicultural rhetoric and in the context of extreme poverty and inequality. Democracy and development constituted a governing assemblage, a network of political regulation, of which violence was not external, but a central constitutive element. Village organizations, in the wake of extreme violence, saw democracy and development as hard-won openings in a rigidly exclusive, racist political order, and as a means of changing that system and as advancing. Democracy and development were thus not depoliticized, but they were seen as concrete spaces for advancement that offered immediate material gains within prevailing political and economic structures that were packaged as very similar to, but as distinct from, revolutionary visions of democracy and development that focused on dismantling hierarchies within the society. Democracy and development thus constituted boundary objects, or ideas and sets of practices that united villagers, the army, other state agents and institutions, and social movements as well, in kind of a common project and in shared fields of action, despite having very different conceptions of what democracy and development were and having very different political aims. Unfortunately, neoliberal democracy and development disappointed local expectations and worked to extend counterinsurgency by other means. And this happened not despite, but as a result of the ways that the villagers tried to reclaim democracy to extend their own political struggles. I describe how democracy was a tangle of elements that were purposely arranged and linked to existing realities and politics in order to produce and reinforce particular kinds of subjects, affects, conceptual horizons, and repertoires for action. Democracy and development reorganized effective imaginaries, landscapes of memory, capacities, self-conceptions, livelihoods, community relations, and political organizational forms and community organizational forms, creating new spaces for agency within this new constricted neoliberal horizon. I show how seemingly disconnected and conflicting elements of democracy work together in the context of extreme poverty and racial inequality to displace radical political desires into a severely reduced political world. They repressed memories of past struggles, reinforced pessimism about the limits of collective agency, empowered new political and economic subjects whose desires and politics fit into the new parameters, telescoping broader conceptions of development and well-being into projects and private forms of market advancement. Democracy and development trained villagers to participate in divisive party politics, promoted narratives of Mayan neutrality during the armed conflict, and celebrated multicultural inclusion while exacerbating class divisions and resentment, sowing mistrust among villagers, aggravating insecurity, fragmenting autonomous political organizations, marginalizing traditional or indigenous governing structures, and blaming indigenous citizens and political leaders for poverty, abandonment, corruption, and democratic failure. I call this the situation where indigenous politicians came to manage and take responsibility for the management of insufficient resources, making decisions about who lives and who dies or who has the means for life and development in communities, the democratization of sovereignty. I also describe the emergence of a democratic ethic of reciprocity that emerged in reaction to this form of neoliberal democracy, which people thought was very divisive and was very frustrating, and how authoritarian populist parties, in particular the FRG, or the Frente Republicano Guatemalteco, harvested the kind of pessimism, uncertainty, vulnerability, and resentment that was a product of neoliberal democracy, only to reinforce the structures that made them inevitable. Authoritarian populism advanced during a transition away from military rule, despite the profound misgivings of its own supporters. Rather than constitute a unified people, as theories of populism often describe, Populism tapped into resentments and divisions and further mutilated capacities for collective action in rural communities. Democracy and development thus constituted a political world defined through privatized experiences of advancement, influence, and access that were tethered to collective defeat, insecurity, uncertainty, and political fragmentation. Founded in violence and linked to market rationality, democracy and development have reshaped grassroots politics and shattered community solidarity more insidiously than the official counterinsurgency campaign, precisely because it operated through the agency of the rural villagers themselves. Despite their historic gains through entering into the political system, democratic politics in San Pedro, as in much of the rest of the rural highlands, has lost its way. This is not because of false consciousness, but as a result of the unmaking and remaking of the political field. So there are more to say about different chapters and things like this, but this is the general overview for the book. Thank you.
Right.